episode may contain language or discussions that may be offensive or triggering. Refer to the episode summary for details. Welcome to She.confidential podcast. I'm Charlene Ketchum, and today I am chatting with Jared Washington. He's a licensed professional counselor and the CEO and founder of H.O.P.E LLC and the author of the new book, Heal or Repeat, Breaking the Cycle of Intergenerational Trauma. I got my advanced order copy in the mail the other day. So I was really excited about that. And y'all can order the book at Barnes and Noble, Amazon, and Target. And we'll include the link for the book in the description box for the YouTube channel and the podcast apps. And it's on the She Confidential episode page. So congratulations on your new book. And thank you for being here to chat with me.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, what inspired you to write this book?
Oh man, that short version, right?
Just don't leave
I've
out, not give
always
us the juicy details. You can give us the short version with the details. We want the tea.
so pretty much, so I'm a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, right? While I was online, I took a class as an elective called the Black Power Years. Um, I remember I remember we were watching a documentary on Marcus Garvey, and I was 19 years old at the time. I'm 31 now. I'll be 32 on August 16th. But um, I remember walking out of the classroom that day and saying to myself, Marcus Garvey had the biggest movement in the African American community, and I've never even heard his name before. And it was mind boggling to me that I've never heard of who this guy was. And we were watching literally the UNIA having parades in, like, I believe it was like Harlem, in the middle of Harlem, parades, thousands of people in uniform, right? And so that kind of spurred me to go read more books on African American history. I ended up picking up the minor African American studies, and so that's what got me passionate about the Black community, about Black people, about our experience and our existence here in this country, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the first piece. The second piece, I feel like I was spiritually pushed to be a mental health therapist, and for I always wanted to do like macro level work, right? Change systems, because again, I'm passionate about Black people, and when we think about Black people, or when I think about Black people, I think about like the oppression, systematic oppression. So I always wanted to change like systems so that we can overall change the how we engage, how we interact, how we live in this country. So I always want to do macro level work. I saw therapy as like micro level, like one-on-one. I'm like, how can I do much change with that? But spiritually, I just kept being pushed in this direction. And so when I was in my grad program, I took a class on trauma, and we just learned about trauma and didn't have a name for it yet. And the professor said, like, yeah, trauma can be passed down through different generations and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, so if trauma can be passed down in different generations, then it's safe to say that trauma from slavery could be passed down, and we can still be seeing the effects of that. And so I shot up. I was like, hey. And I said that. And she was like, yeah, that's possible. And from there, it just took off. And it's kind of interesting because even when I talk to my friends about intergenerational trauma, when I talk to them about the book, and they're always my close friends always like, yeah, man, you've been talking about this stuff for years. And I'm like, really? I didn't even realize it. Like, and so that's what kind of drove me to write about this, because I feel like it's information that you don't really hear. You don't know much about it. You don't hear about intergenerational trauma. You hear about trauma. You hear about PTSD and stuff like that, but you don't hear about intergenerational trauma. And more so, you don't hear about how it impacts Black people. And so that's what drove me to write this book. My passion, I feel like it's my purpose, and I'm walking in it, and that's that's how we're here
Yeah.
today.
That's amazing. I'm proud of you for being obedient, because when a lot of us get that push and we're told like you need to do this, a lot of us we don't do it. We doubt ourselves or we say, "Oh, it's not time." We come up with a lot of things to not do it, but you did it and you're initiating a really important conversation because like you said, that's not something that we've talked about specifically as it applies to Black people. Like I've heard it, we talk about it a lot in reference to things like with the Holocaust, with other, groups of people, but to specifically talk about what happened to, and, Black people who were enslaved, not, not so much.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's exactly the point, right? And so, the research in this in intergenerational trauma, like you said, started from Holocaust, the descendants of Holocaust
Yeah.
survivors. Right? No one is talking about even a book. It's called "It Didn't Start with You" by Mark Woland.
Mm.
I took a CEU and somebody mentioned the book. I got the book, read it. I read most of it. I didn't finish it. And he's talking about intergenerational trauma. He's talking about like the scientific
Mhm.
aspect of it, like with epigenetics and things of that nature. He did not mention Black people not one
Are you serious? When was that book written?
time. I'm not sure, but it's not an old book.
Wait,
It's not.
was it so old
It's not an old
that,
book.
although
I'm a
it's
check,
still,
but it's not an old.
that's baffling. Like how
Mm-hmm.
can you write about that and not, yeah, I don't know why I'm surprised, but that's shocking.
Yep. It was released in 2016. Not one time did he mention the Black
Oh my
experience.
gosh. Wow. And so,
Hmm.
that's why we have to tell our stories.
Hmm. Yep, absolutely. We definitely have to tell our stories, and that's why I think it's important that we just get as many eyes on this book as I can get as many eyes on this book as possible. I don't expect everybody to like it. I don't.
Mhm.
I do know that it's a
Yeah.
heavy read. It's a short read, but it's a
Yeah.
heavy read. Um, I did try to break it up a little bit and add some personal experiences connected with songs and stuff like that. But it's a heavy read and it's hard, and it really makes you not only look in the mirror, but put the mirror in front of your family members as well and your community, and that's hard.
Yeah, but very, very necessary because when we look at, so like last season, I had episodes, well, actually, it was in seasons 1 and 2. So I think I've been building to this without even knowing it.
Hmm.
And that's the funny way God works. Like he'll plant these seeds here and there. And then later you're like, oh, that's what we were doing. Because
Hmm.
in the first season, we had an episode where we were talking about the burden of being a strong woman and how it really is the kiss of death, and it's non-exist. It's just it's a horrible thing to try to make your goal and try to maintain. And one of the parts of the discussion, we talked about mother wounds and just the
Mm.
things we specifically as Black women carry because we've seen our moms engage in so much behavior. And it's not an attack or condemnation on mothers, Black mothers. It's just saying because of their own trauma that these are the ways that they knew to love. These are the ways that they knew to be defensive and protect themselves. And these are the things that they did, to protect and shelter us as well. And then
Yeah.
last season, we had an episode about the value of Black fathers, and it was a similar dynamic there. We talked about the reality that Black fathers, the absence, or even if you have a father who's physically present but not consistently engaged, how that can be so detrimental to the development of Black women because often we think boys need their dads and girls need their mothers when no, you need them both. And so in both those discussions, we talked about how what we observe and receive and don't receive from our parents, how that impacts how we treat ourselves, how we think of ourselves, and how we can be with other partners.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I think you hit it. You're hitting it right on the nose when you said um, as far as now. Let me name this first, and I'm pretty sure it's obvious. I am not. I don't identify as a Black woman. So I will not try to attempt to act like I know what that experience
Mhm.
is like. So I like to always name that when I talk about Black
Yeah.
women, right? But I think that you hit it on the nose when you talked about, um, you know, uh, the process of watching mom and how mom took care of the family, and watching grandmom and how grandmom took care of the family and things of that nature.
Mhm.
That, one of the ways that um, intergenerational trauma or trauma responses are passed down, one of those ways that I identify is through learned
Mm.
behaviors. And not only through learned behaviors, but also storytelling, right?
Mhm.
And so we're watching how it is, to be whatever it is that we're watching, right? So whether that's to be a mother, whether that's to be a father, whatever it is, that's what we're watching. And we, in so many ways, even if we believe it or not, even if, and this doesn't this now this statement doesn't hold true for everybody, right? So I'm not being general in this sense. However, even when we don't even like some of the behaviors that we're seeing, we still can oftentimes
Yeah.
mimic it
Yes.
without even
Yeah.
noticing, right? And so that goes to show you just how deep that stuff or this stuff
Yeah.
can go, you know. So yeah, I think you're hitting it right on the nose with that.
And it's important discussions to have, because it is painful. Like you said, it's heavy. It's really heavy. And right now, I'm actually reading Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper. My wellness coach has suggested that I read this book, and it's out. If you haven't read it, you would really
Mm-hmm.
get a lot of value from it. It is, but they're very short chapters, and they each have a particular focus. Like there's one on feminism and how to kind of reconcile that as a Black woman when you look at the feminist movement as it began with white women. There's a chapter that talks
Mm-hmm.
about how Black women have been misled. And that's actually one of, so far, that was the heaviest one for me because it talks about how Black women were misled in terms of thinking if I make these choices, then everything will work out for me. I can actually have it all. And how that can put you in a spot where you thought if I emphasize my career, if I don't become a statistic and be an unwed teen mom or an unwed mom in general, that I'll find this husband and have this amazing life. And that's not necessarily the case for a lot of Black women who, quote unquote, did the right thing. So in this book, she's really talking about what she observed from her own parents, what she observed. She talks about her grandmother a lot, women in her circle, and she does that storytelling. There's a lot of storytelling, the things that people told her that they experienced. And as I'm reading
Mm-hmm.
it, and when I got your book in the mail yesterday, I was thinking about both of these books, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is so amazing. And I can't remember when her book was published, but when I think about the fact that we've
Mm-hmm.
got this book by this woman and this book by this man, both are talking about things that are related to intergenerational trauma and how they impact our decisions and how they can impact our relationships and how it can evoke a lot of grief from you when you recognize the weight of everything that has been borne by the people before you and how that has now impacted your existence as well. But it's a
Mm-hmm.
necessary conversation because like I just said, that one chapter that I just finished in her book, I was like, oh my gosh, well, this is kind of depressing. Because I'm like, she's absolutely right, but it really helped later when I kind of processed it. I sat back and thought about it, and I said, you know what? I'm glad I read this book, and especially this chapter, because this is a conversation I can have with my nieces. Because I think that we need to tell young Black people that they have more options than we were told we had. And we need to
Mm-hmm.
explain to them why this is the way it was before. And a lot of it was driven by fear and shame. And once we
Yeah.
explain that to them, like the whole world can open up for them. Because I'm listening to this book and I'm like, if I had known at 30 or if I had known at 20 what I've recognized in in the last few years, like it would have been a game changer for me. And so many,
Mm-hmm.
it would have been so liberating. And so that's why I say, like, kudos to you and thank you for writing your book because hopefully people can get this book and have like talk about it, like work through it with young people in particular, so that they can start
Hmm.
understanding like the history behind a lot of what's going down and what's being said around them.
Absolutely. What you said just really brought me to this point, or brought me to this thought that, on my website, I have a quote that says that if trauma can be passed down, then so can
Yes.
healing, right? And so when you said, I can talk to my nieces
Yeah.
about this, right? That's the same thing for me. I can talk to my children about
Yeah.
this stuff. I can identify unhealthy patterns in my
Hmm.
family, that were passed down to me that I experienced, and I can work to create that cycle of healing rather than that cycle of trauma.
Hmm.
But with that being said, when we talk about that level of empathy, I don't look at my ancestors, or I don't look at my mom and my grandmom and I say, yeah, you guys passed down trauma to me, and now I have to do the hard work to break the cycle
Hmm.
and pass down healing. It's like, no, I understand. I understand that you were operating on a survivalist mindset. I get it. But what my goal is that I want to move away from just surviving to thriving. And that's the goal for me. And that's the goal for my children. And hopefully I can pass down some gems to them that they can pass down to their children.
Hmm.
And that we can and ultimately start to not only just affect my family, but affect the community.
Absolutely.
Because that's ultimately what it's about.
Absolutely. Well, we've talked
Mhm.
a lot about intergenerational trauma, and I just realized, like, with the assumption that everybody in the audience knows what it is. So, can you define that for us?
Yes, yes, yes. Intergenerational trauma is trauma responses that are passed down from one generation to the next in a family and or community. And these trauma responses don't even have to actually be experienced by so example, when I say that. So let me give an
Yeah.
example. So my grandmother can experience a traumatic event and experience or display trauma responses. I can then experience those same as her
Mhm.
grandson. I can then experience those same traumatic responses, even though I didn't experience the traumatic event itself. And so that's what intergenerational trauma is those trauma responses being passed down through a generation through generations, whether in a family and or community. The research focuses on the family. I like to also add the community in there as well, because the community has a shared traumatic
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. I'm glad that you broaden it to the community because one of the things that comes to mind for me because again I'm 40. I grew up in the 80s, the era of the crack cocaine epidemic,
Hmm.
and I grew up. My stepfather was addicted to crack cocaine, and so what I saw that do to our neighborhood and to classmates of mine and people, like, even you fast forward like all these years later, and I see what that has done to some people who didn't have certain options or different other support systems, how it has impacted and even has it's impacted me as well, so in different ways.
Hmm.
So I'm glad that you broaden that beyond the family, because for Black people in particular, and other people who have just been mistreated and just abused by the system. But I mean, you look at Native American communities today is like
Hmm.
a classic example of that, as well as what's happened with Black Americans. So I'm glad that you expanded that definition because it certainly extends beyond the family.
Absolutely. And I even, what I think is worth noting is that even in the book, I even talk about how, so I don't stop with just intergenerational trauma.
Mm.
I go further and talk about how those trauma responses that stem from chattel slavery in the Black
Mm-hmm.
community is reinforced by your modern day or your current racial traumatic events. Like and I
Mm.
talk about how, and I go through like the history of it. So we're talking about mass lynching. We're talking about mass incarceration. We're talking about police
Mm-hmm.
brutality, school to prison pipeline. I might not have school to prison pipeline in there,
Mm-hmm.
but school to prison
Mm-hmm.
pipeline, right? The war on drugs, like you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
right? All of these racial traumatic events add another layer of trauma to the Black community, right? And so it literally reinforces those traumatic responses to the point, right? Now, I've been recently thinking about this. I haven't really carved out all of my ideas surrounding it, but to the point where I believe that some of our trauma responses is even labeled as culture. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so when I think about that, I think about, you know, in part, when you think about whooping or spanking your kids, right? Who do we primarily talk about or think about? We primarily talk and think about
Yeah.
black people, right? Or black
Yeah.
parents. Oh, my mother used to spank me or whoop me when I
Yeah.
was younger. That's why I was able to be the man or the woman that I am today. Or oh, if my mother if those was my kids or my mother was watching those kids, or they would have got a spanking in that store, they wouldn't have been acting like that. Where does that come from? Like when we genuinely think about that,
Yeah.
right? Where does that come from? Using
Yeah.
physical punishment as a way to keep somebody in
Yeah.
order, whether it's a child,
Mhm.
whether it's an adult. Where does that come from?
Yeah.
But that's our
Yeah.
culture, right?
And we're proud about it
That's
too. Like until like recent years,
oh,
like I was like, oh yeah, we discipline our kids. And then I
mhm,
really, the more I read and had conversations with other black people who were a little bit more enlightened, I was like, oh, that is problematic. Like we inherited this abusive behavior from when our ancestors were enslaved. I mean, down to picking up switches. Like I don't, my family's from the South, and so people literally
mhm,
got. Now I didn't get whipped with switches, but people got hit. Switches are tree branches, and we
yep,
we did it, and it was like this is how spare the rod, spoil the child. All these things, like we did again what people who enslaved humans did. We found justification for it. We even went to the Bible to find it. So
absolutely, yeah. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. Um, and like I said, we see, we can really,
yeah,
guess and even speculate and even, find facts to where that comes from. But I grew up getting whoopings and spankings and stuff like that, but I don't touch my children. I don't. You know, I have two daughters, and I don't touch them for multiple reasons. Actually, one is what we're talking about now, but another is I don't ever want them to feel like it's okay for a man when he's upset to put his hands
yeah,
on them. And so that's another factor for me.
mhm,
Now, people can say, well, oh, well, even some women could say, oh, I was spanked by my father and I never thought that. I never was in an abusive relationship or abused by someone outside of my family. And I'm like, that's cool for you. But for me, that's not okay.
well, we're teaching them that that's love. I used
Yeah.
to work in it's now called Families and Father Support Center. But
Hmm.
during my work there, we worked with a lot of women. Domestic violence was something that we really encountered with this population of clients, and so I got really educated about it. And prior to that, I had never thought about how we condition young people to see violence as a form of love. How these
Hmm.
spankings, because it's like parents will say, well, you spank your child because you love them and you want to, get them together, keep them in order. But then you also think about the fact that you're teaching your child, and particularly for girls who grow up
Hmm.
and be in relationships with men, you're teaching them that somebody loving you means that they're going to physically reprimand you. And that's not something that
Hmm.
everybody can, turn off or distinguish when they're an adult. If
Exactly.
you've been conditioned to receive this type of treatment, and especially if you've seen your mother, or other adults in your family or around you fight each other and they supposedly love each other, plus you get spankings, you start thinking, oh, well, this is what people who love each other do.
Yeah. Hmm. Exactly. Exactly. And that's what I for me and my children, I want to get away from. I don't tell others what to do with their
Yeah.
children. I just really stick to what I do with mine, and that's something that, I stay away from. And for the reasons that I listed. But so
Yeah,
yeah.
that's very enlightened. Yes, very enlightened because I did not, I didn't make that connection for a long, long, long time until some other friends of mine were like, yeah, that's problematic that we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
What are some other symptoms of intergenerational trauma that you've seen in your research?
So one thing, so I think what's worth noting is I do have a hard time speaking in general terms,
Yeah.
right? However, but I'm going to try.
Well,
I'm going to try.
and you know what? We can give the caveat up front that nothing happens or all the time or applies to all people. But
There we go.
so,
I
y'all,
completely
that's
agree.
here's the caveat that y'all have for the remainder of the
Yeah.
discussion. It does not apply to all people. That include all. When we say men or women, it's not all, and it does not happen all the time. So now we're covered.
Cool. We're covered. Perfect. All right, so some symptoms, right? Some symptoms that you may see, that could be like again unhealthy patterns that you see in your family or with even within a
Mhm.
community, based on present or based on present and past trauma, right? And so like some of those examples could be like unhealthy communication styles, right? We're talking about parenting practices,
Mhm.
disciplinary practices, things like that, right? I think um, for what I see, and specifically in men, right? Now, this is not just exclusive. Now, I'm talking about black
Mhm.
men, but this is not just exclusive for black men. This is, but one thing that I find very that's very strong in black men is the, I don't want to say the inability, but more so the fear of being vulnerable, right?
Mhm.
And that is um something that's really important, and I think is like really like the focus of my another focus of my work. I'll even be transparent and drop a gem here that's probably going to be the focus of my next book is black men and vulnerability. But yeah, so those are some things those are some symptoms that I see, I've seen,
Mhm.
right? Definitely unhealthy communication
Mhm.
styles, um, unhealthy, or I even use the word toxic parenting practices
Yeah.
and disciplinary practices. Those are some big areas and big symptoms where you'll see intergenerational trauma. I'm even trying to think of one more for you, right? Because those are pretty broad. Even anxiety as it relates to being around police
Oh
officers.
yeah, that's a big one.
Right? Myself, as soon as I see those lights go up, I'm 10 and 2.
Yeah.
I got pulled over the other day, and I'll even be transparent. I have my weapons carry permit
Mhm.
and I keep it in the car with me, but I'm still here and I ain't reaching for nothing. I'm here with it. You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? And so, so that anxiety is also a form of
Mhm.
intergenerational trauma. Even how another symptom is how we interact with each other as far as like men and women. How we interact with each other. It can be a form of intergenerational trauma as it relates to, or a symptoms of intergenerational trauma as it relates to, like again, those unhealthy communication
Yeah.
patterns or those unhealthy communication styles, right?
Mhm.
And so, I think those are some symptoms that I've seen
Mhm.
in my research and in some of my work.
Yeah, I think that, and I think you're spot on with all of those. It's like as you were going through, it's particularly the vulnerability one. I know that's something that a lot of women lament about. It's like I gotta get them to open up,
Mhm.
but then we're also kind of women. We can kind of contribute to that anxiety and trauma because we sometimes say that, and then you have some women who are like, oh, he's soft or he's whiny or he's that. So we perpetuate that fear of being vulnerable. And another one that I would add to the list, and I didn't come up with this solely on my own, so let me give credit where credit's due. Um, as I'm reading Eloquent Rage, one of the things that she talks about, and I've talked about this in discussion with a lot of sex therapists, is just the difficulty. in just our sexual autonomy as Black women and how we relate to one another. And a lot of that has really kind of been exploited and perverted by religion. And that's a sticky one
Mm-hmm.
to go there. But it's like society and religion has one set of rules for women and another set for men. And so it's really
Mm-hmm.
set women in this place where, it's not, women don't have that freedom to really be, to explore their bodies, to explore their sexuality. And it set up this standard that of what a good girl is supposed to be. And both men and women have
Mm-hmm.
bought into it. And particularly Black men and women, it's been really bad for us because of what has happened to us historically. Because we all of
Mm-hmm.
our, ability to define our sexuality, to even protect our bodies, it was taken away from us. And so I think we see a
Absolutely.
whole nother set of traumas that have kind of manifested from that, and how we view, should men change their daughters' diapers, those kind of things, those kind of distrusts that are kind of embedded in our community because we've seen so many things that have happened to young Black girls. We couldn't protect them. And so we have this natural kind of fear to make them be girls as long as possible because we look at everybody as a potential predator. And for adult women, or women who have come of age, it's like, nah, I need you to cover up and be this way and be chaste, however you define that, because then if men see you as a good woman, they will treat you accordingly. And it's been even
Mm-hmm.
harder, for Black women compared to anyone else because historically we've always been viewed as promiscuous and all these other negative attributes related to our body and our sexuality. And it's contributed to complicating things a bit for Black men and women too.
Yeah. I mean, even think about perfect example. Think about the song, what is it? With Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion, WAP, right? Everybody was up in arms
Yeah.
about it, right? And mind you, that's the on the opposite end, that's the culture of hip hop as it relates to men rapping,
Yeah.
right? And, so, and and there's actually a song, that that came out, maybe a little bit before WAP that everybody loves and sings. You know what I'm saying? By a man. You know what I'm saying? I ain't even gonna say the name because the name is so crazy
I
or
know what you're
whatever.
talking
But
about.
yeah, right. And so like so that just shows you. So me and my best friend, we talk about this type of stuff all the time, and one thing that he pointed out, he's also MSW. He works in the school system. He's like an assistant principal or something like that. And so he was telling me, he was like, the thing is that sex, we're taught that men are supposed to enjoy sex, but women aren't,
Yes.
right? And so, and I was like, wow, that's
We're all
deep. I'm
taught
like, that's
that.
so true.
We're all
Huh?
taught that. It's like for women,
Mm-hmm.
nobody, and it's so what's interesting is there's another episode this season that will talk about pelvic floor therapy and as it relates to people who are suffering from bladder bowel and sexual discomfort. And one of the reasons why I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to have that discussion was because unfortunately, we know a lot of women suffer from discomfort during intercourse. Women who are in relationships with men, they suffer from a lot
Mm-hmm.
of discomfort. And a lot of women who are in relationships with men don't have orgasms. And it's like, this is ridiculous because they've got Viagra for men. They've got all these things to help them out. None of those things are like essential, but like basic essential things. Or let me scratch that because I do believe sexual activity is essential. It's a normal human activity. But what I'm saying is there's this disparity when we look at men being able to have pleasure versus women. And women have legitimate, like physical challenges and discomforts during intimacy, physical intimacy with men. And healthcare providers aren't asking about it. If they do inquire about it, there's a recent study that showed that only I'll have to look it up. I'm not gonna quote the actual stat since I don't have the study right in front of me. But it was really bad,
Mm-hmm.
and that of cisgender women who do seek medical attention for sexual discomfort, most of them are not getting any referrals to pelvic floor or therapists or sex therapists. It's just like, okay, well, that's sex is just going to be uncomfortable for you. And that's
Yeah.
unlikely, to happen. Men don't experience that sort of thing. And for women who
Mhm.
are sexually liberated, especially publicly, like Megan or Cardi B, it's like, oh my gosh, that's a skank. That's not who you want to take home to your mama. But men can do
Mhm.
it all the time, and men, in fact, they will brag about all of their conquests, and it's that gives them points. That gives them all kind of bragging rights. And with women, it's completely different. It's like supposedly every man wants you to be a Mother Teresa, but that can't possibly be the case because that's not who they're choosing to hook up with lots of the time. So there's this
Mhm.
gap in like what's being presented versus the reality, and women end up losing a lot of times on that.
Absolutely. And we gotta name it. It's white supremacy and
It
patriarchy.
is.
We gotta name it. That's what it
Yeah,
is.
it is.
That-
Yeah.
that's exactly what it is. And so, however, I think we need to work collectively to dismantle that
Yes.
white supremacy and patriarchy. Well, patriarchy, I believe, is just under the umbrella of white
Yeah.
supremacy. But, um, but yeah, we have to work together because I think us both, and I don't mean me and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
specifically,
Yeah.
but I mean us men and
Hmm.
women hold patriarchy and white supremacy up. Us black men and black
We
women,
do.
we hold it up a
Yeah,
bit,
we do.
you know, in some areas, and that's not a blame game. That's not saying like, oh, how dare you hold up white
No.
supremacy and patriarchy. It's like, no, we've been conditioned to do so, almost to the point where you surviving is a little hard if you don't.
Yeah. And like you said, you have to name it before you can address it. Like you
Hmm.
have to give it a name. You have to acknowledge that this is what we're dealing with.
Hmm. Absolutely, absolutely, and even just to tie it back right to intergenerational
Mhm.
trauma. That's all of
It
that.
is.
Racial traumatic events. It's all of that. It's all spurred or all the catalyst to it
Yeah.
is white supremacy.
Yes.
It's white supremacy. You know, making us conditioning us to believe that we are inferior in some type of way. But we're seeing
Mhm.
a big shift from that. I
I believe
believe
so too.
we're
Yeah.
we're seeing a very big shift. Granted, there's a lot of different people with different agendas, but we're seeing a shift,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is good, which is what we need, what we want. We might not all be on the same page, but at least we're opening our eyes to what's right in front of us,
Yeah.
um, and speaking out about it.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah. People, yeah.
but yeah,
They're aware there's a
sorry.
problem and people are starting to talk about it publicly. Like that's what's so amazing
Hmm.
because even a conversation like this, like even maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I never like most of the conversations I've had on She Confidential, I would have thought I would have publicly. Like I pretty much talk about everything with people in my circle, and I've worked in medical publishing and healthcare. And so when we start talking about things involving the body, like that's natural to me to have those
Hmm.
conversations because I've worked in some way in the medical arena. So it's like, okay, talking about sex is natural. But
Hmm.
I still, up until a few years ago, would have been like, I don't know if women should do a song like WAP. You should probably shouldn't do
Hmm.
that. That's not like what a nice woman would do. Like I would be mortified to do it. But what I have learned is even though I wouldn't, that's not for me to do because I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable. Like that's not me and how I choose to communicate how I feel, it is absolutely acceptable for another woman to choose to do that. And I shouldn't look at
Yeah.
another woman and say, well, she's bad or she's whatever because she chose to communicate and present herself in a different way. No, it doesn't diminish
Yes.
her standing in at all. And so that's something that I have to constantly like reprogram and catch myself. And it's amazing how often when you're really, once you learn and become aware of it, it's amazing how often you catch yourself judging. Like, especially for me as a woman, how often I catch myself like judging other women. Because even I think it was on, I think it was the very first episode I recorded for this podcast. We were talking about, and it was three of us. So it was Tiffany Hogan. She's got a podcast called Bad Moms Village, and Lauren Spearman, and her podcast is Check on Your Strong Friends. And so we were having like this girl talk, and we were talking about men getting in your DMs on social media and all this stuff. And I was like, I've only had one person do that. And the one time that happened to me was because there was this game people were playing. It was like, and you know how they do those goofy games on Facebook. And it was like, put a color as your status. And it's the color is what color underwear you're wearing. But only the women were supposed to know the game. Men weren't supposed to know what we were doing. So this was like well, no, this is more than 8 years ago. This is, I think, probably like in 2009 or 10 that this happened. And so I played the game. I put the color up in my status. Well, apparently, men knew the game we were playing because this guy I knew from high school inboxes me and starts making all these comments. And I'm like, see, if I hadn't played this game, he wouldn't have felt like he could come at me like this. And now today, on another level, I would say, no, that's not, because it doesn't matter what game I was playing. He still shouldn't have came at me like that. But then I immediately blamed myself. I was like, see, if I hadn't played this game, he wouldn't be coming to me like this. And so on the show, when we were talking about that, I said, women have to be aware of what you may be inviting, not blaming women for the behavior of men. But it's like, we know a lot of men just, they can't control themselves. And so we have to be mindful of that. So if you have a profile picture and all your boobs hanging out, and or if you in a thong and you bent over and it's your profile pic, they're gonna be in your DM. And I said this on the first episode that I recorded like last fall. But even looking back at that, I'm like, ooh, that's kind of cringy. Because at the end of the day, like if that's what you choose to put as your profile picture, and if you want to talk about sex all day on your profile, like men got to learn to control themselves, men and women. You got to control yourself. Like you still don't have the right to invade this person's space unless they specifically like invite you in. Now, I do think that we still have to balance that with some realness about our intentionality, because people say, well, I don't want this attention. But then you also have to think about, like, most of us are making conscious choices and how we choose to present ourselves. So you also have to be accountable to yourself and be real with yourself. Like, what was I really looking for when I chose that picture to put out there? But the people on the other side also have to realize she ain't invite me for anything until she explicitly invite me for something. And that's something that I still have to like struggle with, because I'm still like, okay, ladies, we know how some of these men are. It's what was it? It was a concert, Lollapalooza in Chicago last week, or last week. And one of my guy friends sent me a picture of it, and he was sending it to me because he's like, look at these people, they act like COVID doesn't exist. And I said, well, I would never go to that even without COVID, because I would be afraid of what those men would do to me. And he was like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I would never be in a crowd with that many men, especially men that I knew were drunk and everything. I went to a club, this is many years ago, and it was like a regular club. And again, just the programming, I was like, I wasn't wearing anything like revealing, but I'm like, this dude grabbed me, grabbed my butt. I told him like, stop. And he was a jerk about it. And it ended up getting, resolved, but it was really uncomfortable. And so what that taught me was like, don't be in a situation like with a bunch of guys around you like that. And so I'm like, I would never go to Lollapalooza. And he's like, I never would have thought about that. And I said, well, because you're a man. You don't have to think about somebody possibly raping you. I'm like, women have gotten raped at events like that. So I wouldn't go to that because I don't know what I could be putting myself in the middle of. And that's still like that thinking that, okay, as a woman, I have to be hyper vigilant and think about the behaviors of a few bad actors, because it's not most men who are that way. But you have to consider that. And that's the thing that I have to think about as a woman, to not judge other women or say, like, what did she do? to contribute to this man's behavior. No, that's on him. It really is.
Yeah. Yep. I totally agree with everything that you just said. Like I can't even say it any better. And like I said earlier, I'm not going to speak in the, in the place of a black woman. So, but as far as us as black men, I mean, just to be transparent about it, we got to do better. We got to do better. Or just men, period. Not even just
Yeah.
black men. So let me not even just say black men, but men, period. We have to do better. We have to do better.
How do women help for black women who are with black men? How do we help black men do better, especially when we talk about like vulnerability and opening up and just feeling? How do we create safe spaces for black men, both in intimate relationships, but even just as our friends?
That's a good question, and I'm gonna tell you why. Um, I just saw a post the other day. Um, it said women shouldn't be. I can't remember the exact word they used, but it was just ultimately what the post was saying, that women shouldn't be uh, um, places for men to get better,
Hmm.
right? And so it was like so you hear people say like, um, or I've heard people say that, oh, like maybe from women or just people, period, just say, oh, I can change this guy, or I can, get this guy to be
Hmm.
better, or this guy comes with this baggage
Hmm.
or this trauma, or he needs a good woman to heal him and
Yeah,
stuff
that's
like that, you know. And I think that's what the post was getting
hmm
at. The post was getting at that women should women shouldn't be the ones to start that process for men, right? And so that's why I said that's an interesting question. When I seen it, I was like, damn, that's pretty good. Like, that's a pretty good thought. But what can women do to kind of, create that safe space,
hmm
right? Um, trying to think the I'm trying to think of the language, because I'm very intentional about the language that I use. I don't know if that's
yeah, that matters. It makes a big difference.
yeah. I think that women can they don't have to create the space, but convey to men that there is a space if they want to utilize it, where they can be vulnerable without consequence and repercussion. Because again, we talked about how there's people, men and women alike, who uh, provide consequence for
Hmm.
vulnerability in men. Man up, oh, he's too soft.
Yeah,
I like women nice and
yeah.
hard or whatever. You know what I'm saying? And so, just conveying that message, like, hey, there is a space for you if you want to utilize it, where you can be vulnerable. And there's growth in vulnerability. Yeah, it's going to be
Mhm.
uncomfortable, but there's growth in vulnerability. You can be vulnerable with me if you want to, you know. Um, so yeah, so I think that is something that's helpful. I know, like, for me, um, sometimes I may just want somebody to listen, not provide a solution, not be a fix me, you know, just listen, just listen to what I gotta say, you know. So I think those are some areas that uh, women or just even people can do for men, as it relates to helping them in those areas. But again, I'm really big on that vulnerability piece. So I keep bringing
Yeah.
it up.
Yeah.
I keep I keep bringing it up because I really think it's so 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 important. It's so important. You know,
Yeah.
or even. Oh, sorry.
Mm-mm.
What were
No,
you gonna say?
no, it's like, yeah.
I think it's so important that we as men get to a space where we can engage with our emotions because we have them. We have them. They are not only for women. We are human beings. We feel. We emote. We have them. Sit with them. Experience them. Express them. Anger is not the only acceptable emotion for men. You know. So yeah. So that vulnerability piece, that space, it doesn't have to be created, but just know that it's there.
Yeah.
So,
I feel like more men are talking about that now in the last 2 years.
mm,
I don't know if there's, and you would be able to speak on this more than I would, but I don't know if it's like this sudden explosion of more black male therapists and suddenly, and
mm-hmm,
that's what's kind of helping facilitate this movement. But I feel like there's been so much more conversation around men just being visible, letting their vulnerability be visible, and talking about the fact that I'm vulnerable too. I just think that
yeah,
you guys feel that sometimes you have to repress emotions and things like that. And so for a long time, women have thought, oh, they don't have any feelings. Like I've heard so many friends say that. I've felt like that. I think only
mm-hmm,
emotions I would often see that men that I knew, both and not just in dating, but just in general, that the most visible emotions were anger or passion, like for a sport or music or sex. Like is those two things, but sadness,
yeah,
grief, loss. That's not something you saw often with men unless it was like their sports team lost or something. That's
yeah,
acceptable to be sad. And so it's just so refreshing and also it can be a little scary as a woman. I have to say that because when you see that a man is really upset or like overwhelmed, because it's like when a man is overwhelmed or lost, you're like, oh my God, like, I don't like what do you do? Like, what do you do for him? Because we traditionally like we don't see y'all like that. You're like way up here. And it's like, okay, what do I do? Do I hug him? Do I just sit here and be quiet? Like what does he need? And the most simplest thing is what you just said. Just say, what do you need? What do you want me to do right now?
exactly. Just ask. Just ask. Communication, right? And so, you know, I am seeing more black men in therapy and working on vulnerability. Still struggling, but working on vulnerability, which is a step and is great. I love it, right? It's helpful to be vulnerable with your therapist. It's also helpful to be vulnerable with your friends, to be vulnerable with your spouse, your partner. You know, um, I'm gonna trip you out. I got two quick little stories for you. Um, I always said that, and I said it just a couple minutes ago, that the acceptable emotion for black men is
Mm-hmm.
anger, right? I'm gonna trip you out because anger is actually a secondary emotion.
Then it's something
You
fear.
might already know
Yeah,
that,
it's like fear and
huh?
love are the two emotions, right?
Oh, as far as underlying anger?
Yeah, or just in general.
Oh,
Like yeah.
not that I've never heard that
Okay.
before. I'll be honest, I've never heard that before. However, but I do know that anger is actually a secondary emotion. Usually, there are other emotions that are um, underlying or fueling that anger. So when we even talk about in mental health, when we talk about depression, right? The one one of the questions that I ask men, period, when when I think that they're dealing with depression, I say, "Are you experiencing any irritability?" I never ask if they're experiencing sadness.
Mm.
Are you experiencing irritability? Yeah. Okay. Then you got some other symptoms like lack of energy or uh, um, struggling to get out of bed and you know stuff like that. All the other stuff. But I rarely ask about sadness. If they bring it up, then yeah, okay. I'm like, okay, so sadness there as it relates to depression, right? You know. But I always ask about irritability, and that's a symptom of it. Because there can be some sadness that's fueling that.
Okay. Yeah,
You get what
that
I'm
makes
saying?
sense.
And so, yeah, and
Yeah.
so you know, like I had somebody say, oh, I don't, I think it might have been on another podcast or a show or something. I can't remember. And they were like, yeah, you know, this I knew a person and they were just always angry and yada yada yada. Yada. I'm like, they're probably sad. They're probably sad or ashamed or guilt or something. It's not just anger. It's not. It's not. But that's the acceptable emotion. And so that's the emotion that it's okay to express. I remember being a kid, I could never cry in front of my
Yeah.
friends. If I was to cry in front of my friends, they would kill me, not physically or literally, but figuratively. They would destroy me. They were like, "Yo, why you crying
Yeah.
for? Man up, you're a little girl."
Yep.
And I'm talking about back in the. I'm not that old, but back in the
Yeah.
day, you know, you couldn't do that. You couldn't do that at all. You know, um, but I'll trip you out. So my uncle passed. Um, because I too. So I'm not speaking about this on this high seat where it's like, yeah, I got vulnerability figured out. No, I'm still working on it myself. And so I had my uncle passed away, right? A little while ago. And I remember I was talking with a friend. I remember I cried at the doctor's office unintentionally. I cried in the car by myself unintentionally. And I was talking to a friend, a colleague and friend. She's also a therapist. And I was telling her about it, and she was like, "Well, have you cried in front of your wife yet?" And I was like, "Nah, I didn't." And she was like, "Why?" And I sat with that, and I was like, "Man, I'm like, maybe I'm conditioned not to in so many ways,
Yeah.
you know." And I had to have that conversation with her where I was like, "Yo, like I've kind of been intentionally not crying in front of you because I don't want you to see me like this." And I had to dissect that. I had to really like take a step back and say, what what is it that's and even though I know now, right? But what is it? What was it that was stopping you from doing that? You know, and if I'm not being vulnerable with her at that time, how could we grow? How could I grow? Am I being 100% with her? And so, so yeah, so that's why I was saying I would trip you out with those two little stories. But yeah, so yeah, that vulnerability piece is big. This is extremely big, and we're not taught to do it at all. Actually, I I did a presentation, and forgive me if I'm talking too
No, you're
much,
good.
but I did a presentation with some high schoolers in New Jersey. It was virtual. It was over Zoom. It was during COVID. It was about mental health for Black boys, and this kid, I was like, I was I was taken aback, and it takes a lot to really like take me back. The kid said, high school boy, Black boy, he said, "Yeah, my dad told me not to show emotion because I got to be strong for my family." And I said, it took me back because I'm like, "Yo, we still preaching this?" I was like, "What? This is 2020." Well, this was when it happened, when he said it. I'm like, "This is 2020. We still preaching this?" And even as I was breaking it down for him, he still was like, "I'm not sure." And even the young ladies in the group, it was like maybe like 50 kids in here, mixed boys and girls, and even the girls were like, "Yeah, that doesn't make sense. You have emotions. How are you gonna be strong if you're repressing or suppressing your emotions? How are you gonna be strong once you eventually break down?"
And what a heavy burden that is to carry.
Exactly. Exactly. So.
And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that, your own personal experience, because I think when you were saying that, it made me think about experiences, or a particular experience I had with somebody in my life that just totally closed down when something big had happened in his life. And I was like, okay, why isn't he like sharing with me? Because if it were me, I'd be crying all over the place. So surely he's upset. So why isn't he doing this? And then later he said, I wasn't gonna sit down and cry like that in front of you. And it took me talking to my therapist about it to understand it wasn't about me. It really was about, because I felt like, what am I not doing to make myself accessible to where he knows that he can do this? But he said, and he said it to me like so like matter of fact. He's like, I haven't cried in front of anybody. I wouldn't do that. Like,
Mm.
wow. Well, why? First of all, I'm not anybody. You can cry in front of me. He's like, no, I'm not crying in front of anybody. It's a hard thing to unlearn and to recognize, but it made me feel really sad for him and for anyone who can't, who's been conditioned to not do that, because that's so much to carry all on your own. And for our kids, because I still hear people say to their little boys, don't cry. You're supposed to be a man. Like, be tough, be tough. And so we're teaching them, showing emotion means that they're weak. Like, well, sometimes life is going to make you feel weak. And that's okay, because that's what we're here for. When you feeling like you're not strong enough, that's what we're here for. And
Yep.
that's not the message that's always communicated, or even people may say it, but then their behavior shows something else. And even the way that we sometimes describe men in particular, because women, like I said earlier, we got that kind of bad. We'll say, I want him to communicate with me, but then we'll say, oh, he's soft, or he's this or that. No, because that all goes together. Because if they hear you saying that this guy is soft because he's opening up, then for him to say to you, you know what, I don't know if I can move forward in this relationship because I'm scared of what being a father means. I'm scared of what being a husband means. He's not going to tell you that when he
Yeah.
hears you talk about this other guy being soft for speaking on his fears and things, because it's really all in the same.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. Yeah. That whole weakness piece for vulnerability is just, it's, at this point, is for me, is like, wow, um, we really feel like that. We really feel like crying is a form of weakness, showing emotion, doing something that's natural.
Yeah.
Weakness. Yeah.
How do we start to change it with our kids? And it's probably easier with the kids because they don't have all that baggage poured into them yet. So how do we change it with our kids, and how do we change it as adults?
Oh, it takes. I'll be perfectly honest. I think with some adults, we may not be able to change it. I think kids are more impressionable. Kids are, they're like sponges. They're soaking
Mhm.
up just everything. They're soaking up all the information, whether it's being taught to them through words, or whether it's being taught to them through behaviors. Um, you know, but how do we change it? Right? We change it by, I think, by like having conversations like
Mhm.
this, right? Um, but also, I think what can be helpful, is having these conversations, but also seeing the effects of vulnerability,
Mm.
being able to see how there's growth in it.
Yeah.
You know, um, one of my children had, they were born when they were born, they had the cord around their neck, right,
Mm.
and they weren't breathing when they came out, right. And luckily, NICU came. Luckily, they started breathing afterwards, like shortly afterwards. That for me, that was traumatic,
Yeah.
right? When I got to the car to call my mom was like, "Yo, why you not happy?" And I'm telling her about it, and I'm like, and I just busted out crying.
Yeah.
And then she's like, okay, okay, well, he's good now, yada yada yada. Cool, we hung up, right? And I remember immediately thinking to myself, I said, yo, how do people hold that stuff in? I was like, how do people hold that in? I'm like, I couldn't even help it.
That's how it spills over into other things. That's cause of inflammation in your body, elevated cortisol levels, people having heart attacks. We're seeing so many young people who are having strokes, heart attacks, high blood pressure. That's what happens when you're walking around carrying all that grief.
Absolutely. And so we got to start the conversation, continue having the conversation, and also being able to see the effects of how we can grow from vulnerability. I think that's how we can ultimately start to change it, you know, uh, and really just, yeah, that's what I think. That's what I think.
And your book is a perfect conversation starter for everyone. So I know that they can purchase it Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and Target. Do you offer any other services? Like I know that so for your therapy services and everything, you're in Georgia, right? And
Yes,
are
yes.
you doing like virtual sessions so anyone in Georgia could reach out to you for potentially working with you for virtual services or in person services?
Right now I'm doing virtual. However, I'm only doing virtual right now, due to COVID and all that good stuff. But yes, anyone in Georgia can reach out to me for one-on-one individual therapy services. Yes.
What other services what clients do you see? Do you do couples therapy or just are you focused on just men? Who do you see?
I see right now. So I'm open to see. I don't do couples. I only do individual. However, I am open to seeing men, women. I do have a mixture of men and women, but the primarily black men reach out to me for services. So I get a lot of black men reaching out for services. So
Wonderful.
you can, yeah. So you can say my clientele mainly is black
That's
men.
wonderful. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Yeah. And also I do offer consulting services. If anyone wants to consult about private practice, want to consult about just mental health, I offer that as well. Um, so, and you can also check out my website where you can see all the things that I do, some of the different media outlets I've been on, and you know, you can also purchase the book from there as well. Just I wanted that to be an option as well.
Good.
But my site is www.jwhope HOPE services.com.
Go to his website and purchase the book, y'all. Scratch those little kids. Purchase directly from him. Yes.
Yeah. And you can also find me on Instagram as well as j.washington.hope.
Wonderful. Thank you. I know we could go on talking like for hours about this. But I mean, hopefully it will inspire other people to really start examining how some of the things in their family has influenced, their current mindsets and behaviors and relationships and just how to really embrace vulnerability. And for the audience, drop a note in the comments about like how have you overcome struggles with vulnerability because men and women struggle with it to different degrees. So, yeah, let us know how you've overcome some of your struggles with vulnerability and make sure you're following Jared on social media. I'll have all of his social media links and the website link in the description box on the podcast app and on YouTube and on the She Confidential website page. And get the book, purchase it from his website. And please tune in next time to She Confidential. So thank you, Jared, for chatting with me today. Congratulations. I'm really thankful for you for being obedient and following your purpose and initiating these conversations and for all your work with Black men. So needed and so appreciated. So thank you.
Thank
And audience, I'm Charlene Ketchum. This is She Confidential. Until next time.